Welcome from the First Presbyterian Church in Burbank. We're glad you're here. Let's join the service now and hear the proclaiming of God's Word.
Jesus has been looking at the crowds, moved with compassion on them. And he wanted them to know, of course, like he wants us all to know today, how precious we are to God. He saw people who were hurting. They were poor. They had been told by institutions and other people that they didn't amount to anything. They didn't matter to anyone. And Jesus, I believe, moved with compassion, sat down and began to teach them. And we've been going through this series for the last several weeks about the, Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, salt and light last week. This week we're looking at Jesus being the fulfillment of the law. And then we'll continue this series, of course, through chapter 7, Matthew 5 through 7, Sermon on the Mount. We'll find pieces of that in Luke's gospel as well. But as we go through the series, we're going to take a look today at Jesus' words about being the fulfillment of the law. Listen to the word of the Lord, beginning with verse 17. Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And since we just read those words, another appropriate expression could be, yikes. What Jesus says is so very strong here. So let's unpack that this morning. One of my favorite courses in college was Judaism. I had a rabbi as a professor. And he taught the course on Judaism, but he also invited us to come. Any of the students wanted to come, you could come to his synagogue, and he would love to share the culture and the tradition of the Jewish people and share with you about their practices and beliefs. Well, you can imagine that I took him up on the offer, and I loved to go to the synagogue. I remember my first time in the synagogue and how scared I was. Because it's frightening to go to a place that you don't know, isn't it? Wondering if you do something, are you doing something wrong? Are you going to offend someone? And I was very particular, but that was immediately overcome by sitting in the synagogue and all of his congregants, the Jewish people, turning and just so honored that me, a Gentile, would be with them. And they were eager to show me their traditions and customs and to explain things to me, and I loved that moment. One particular trip to the synagogue, I'll never forget the time when the rabbi with his robe and his prayer shawl went over to the ark, which is the closet, and opened it up, and he brought out the Sefer Torah, which is the Torah scrolls. And he walked around the sanctuary, and as he walked around the sanctuary, the people just stood there smiling and reaching for it and touching it. And some people would touch the Torah scrolls and then kiss their hand as a sign of being blessed, the Torah blessing their lives. I remember another time that I was there, and my rabbi, if you will, asked me to come up and read from the Torah scroll. And I was frightened to do that. And he had the pointer there, and I remember kind of reading some of it, and it was very obvious at that moment that I was pathetic in Hebrew. That's probably a good way to put it. And he smiled, and the people just smiled. But of course, just that affirmation and the love that somebody wanted to learn. Somebody wanted to be a part of your people. And I always look back on that as a fond time of learning about Judaism. And I've come even today to love Judaism and her people. We look at our scripture today. I wanted to point that out and talk about Judaism because Jesus was a Jew. I know that's not a surprise to you. But in our faith, we tend to forget that. And Jesus was not just a Jewish man. He was an observant Jew. We hear from Luke's gospel, the very first thing of his life is that Mary and Joseph took him to the temple in Jerusalem every year. It was their custom. Now, they were not required to do that. Jewish men who lived 13 miles outside of Jerusalem had to go for the 3 great festivals. But if you lived outside of the 13-mile range, you didn't have to go to Jerusalem. You could observe the holiday or the holy days in your synagogue. But Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Jerusalem, which was a long and strenuous walk, several days' journey every year, because they wanted their son to be raised with God's people in Judaism. We see, at least I would like to think, that even as a young boy, Jesus probably went to the synagogue very often in his hometown. He got to know the Pharisees and the teachers and the rabbis. I think that was the same was true for him as a teenager and then as an adult. When he went off into his ministry at 30 years of age as an itinerant rabbi and miracle worker, I think Jesus, wherever he went, as he walked into a village, probably saw the synagogue and probably smiled. That this is where people came to honor and worship and love his Father in heaven. We find that in the Scriptures, Jesus does go to the synagogues until he's thrown out and forbidden to go back into a synagogue again. But he's an observant Jew. I imagine Jesus established relationships with the rabbis and the Pharisees in the town. We know in the book of Acts, the 6th chapter, that after his death and resurrection, it says, and many priests became obedient to the faith. That means several people, lots of people accepted him as the Messiah of Judaism, though some did not. Jesus loved Judaism. We have a phrase today that goes around, and maybe you've used it. I used it at one time too until I thought through its implication. It says, I hate religion, but I love Jesus. I think that's a shame, that statement. Because Jesus loved religion. He just hated the things people added to it that kept them away from God. Jesus loved religion. He knew, like we know, it could never save us. In fact, we know that very moment when salvation comes is when Jesus on the cross cried out, "It is finished!" And religament took place. God and humans were one in Jesus. I don't think religion is the problem. I think hypocrisy is. I don't think religion is the problem. I think Jesus was a very observant Jew. I think he just got frustrated and tired of people who added things in the way of a relationship with God. Central to Jesus' life was the law of God. We learn from the Scriptures that he came to fulfill them. We just read that. If anyone knew the law of God, Jesus did, because he is the law of God. In fact, we learn through John's Gospel, the Word made flesh, the Logos, which can be translated not only word, but speech. The speech of God. God, who formed the universe and spoke. Jesus is the speech of God made flesh. He was there with Moses at the burning bush. He was there with Moses at Mount Sinai. He was the law given to Moses. Jesus says, I'm here to fulfill the law. Central to his life was the law of God. But what is the law of God? Well, Jesus and the religious leaders of his day, some of them, not all of them, even great Nicodemus would come to agree with Jesus, but the great teacher of Israel. But some of them believed that the law of God had to be explained. Jesus and the religious leaders would have agreed that the 10 Commandments, we know them, the Decalogue, God delivered through Moses, the 10 Commandments. Those are God's law. That's revealed by God. Everyone would agree, Jesus and the religious leaders. This is the revealed principles of God for all people, not just for Israel, but for all people, the 10 Commandments. The law is good. But if we're honest about considering the 10 Commandments, we run into a problem at the very beginning. Imagine for a moment that you were creating your own nation, your own people, and you could give them 10 laws to govern themselves. Would you choose the same ones that God chose? You might say to yourself, well, of course. Thou shalt not steal. Any society that has stealing as an acceptable practice will soon collapse in on itself. You might say, well, of course, thou shalt not murder, because any nation or people group that believe in murder will soon not be there. But would you use what God found important? Honor the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods beside him. Or would you say, remember the Sabbath day? Would you choose one of those as your 10 principles to govern a nation? Or how about if you said, you shall not covet? We might say, well, gosh, I don't know if I'd waste that on my principles for my nation, because who cares what people think? God does. Those 10 commandments, not suggestions, 10 commandments, are what God views as being important for all people. How far we are from God. These are the things that God holds to be the sacred fabric of life for any society, group, nation, people. The 10 commandments. Now, the religious leaders believe that, and Jesus did as well. As we look at our passage, though, we see that there's a difference. That Jesus will take the 10 commandments, and the religious leaders will take the 10 commandments, and they'll go into different places. They'll take a different path, if you will. We find that of the 10 commandments, there are 613 implications in commandments in the Bible from those 10 commandments. 613. From that, here would be the vision. Jesus, whereas he would look at those 10 commandments and say, look, if you concentrate on 2 aspects of those 10 commandments, you fulfill the law. Love the Lord your God. Love other people. Because if you love the Lord your God, you're not going to have other gods. If you love the Lord your God, you're going to keep the Sabbath day. If you love the Lord your God, you're not going to take God's name in vain. If you love other people, you're not going to steal from them. You're not going to murder them. You're not going to be jealous of them. So where Jesus took the 10 commandments and said 2 principles will keep you abiding all those principles in the law, fulfilling the law, the religious leaders went the opposite direction. They saw the 613 in the Bible and they said, okay, we need to begin explaining those 613. And by the 3rd century AD, they codified those laws that had been handed down throughout tradition. Those 613 laws based on 10 became 63 books called the Mishnah. The Mishnah was almost 800 pages long. That was just the beginning of the oral traditions of the law of God. The scribes and legal experts created the Talmud. And the Talmud is commentaries on Mishnah, which is an explanation of the 613, which is an explanation of the 10. The Jerusalem Talmud Yerushalmi, is 12 volumes. The Babylonian Talmud is 63 volumes, 6,200 pages in length. Can you imagine being governed by 6,200 pages every single moment of your life? Becomes very complicated, doesn't it? How can a Jewish person keep all the aspects of God's law? Is that God's law? When it came to the Sabbath day, for instance, God simply said, you're not to work on the Sabbath day. The religious experts began asking the question, what does that mean? For some of us, as we know, getting out of bed is a huge work for the day. What constitutes a work? Well, as they began to define it, they said, well, you can't carry a burden that day. Oh, fair enough. What's a burden? Well, here's what a burden's described at. Food equal to a dried fig. Or enough wine for putting in a goblet of milk, or milk enough for one swallow, or the amount of honey that can be put on a wound, water enough to moisten your eyes, paper enough to write just 2 letters of the alphabet. If you carry more than those weights, you are breaking the Sabbath day, according to the religious experts during Jesus' day. That seems very complicated, doesn't it? In fact, I would dare say you'd probably do a lot of work trying to keep yourself from doing that work. What is work on the Sabbath day? Well, the scribes interpreted that writing 2 words could constitute work. If you put a word on the ground in the dust and you put a word on the wall of a house, that isn't breaking the Sabbath day. But if someone came along who could read both those words and formed a sentence, you, who wrote it, broke the Sabbath day. If you wrote those words, those two words, in permanent marker, like ink or paint, you're guilty. But if you wrote those words with dark fluid fruit juice or the dirt or sand, you're not guilty. Unless someone could read those words. Then you, the writer, are guilty. Now, keep in mind, to break the Sabbath day, the consequence is death. What if you're a tailor? What if on Thursday or even Friday morning, you were pinning somebody's clothing up and somehow you put a pin in your garment? And maybe you wore the robe on the Sabbath day at Friday evening sunset. And you forgot about the pin that was in your garment. You had brought your work over in the Sabbath day. You must be put to death. Or a woman who had false hair or somehow, and she took that off for the Sabbath day, but there was a strand on a piece of her clothing. She broke the Sabbath day. Or you're a father who wanted to pick up his child and you forgot it was a Sabbath day and picked up your child. You're guilty of doing work on the Sabbath day. Now, I love Judaism. And I love the fact that the reason, the impetus for all those laws was to obey God. I believe Jesus loved that fact as well. But what he saw was the bind of humanity that had taken God's law, which could be summarized in two: love the Lord and love other people. And now it had become so complicated. People were burdened with, what can I do? What can I not do? Am I a sinner? Yes, you're a sinner. Do the laws seem restrictive? I think so. But they were traditions of men. And that's where Jesus and the religious leader of his day opposed each other. If that's the case, then Jesus is a lawbreaker. And friends, that's exactly why he was crucified. Because he broke the traditions of men. According to Jewish leaders, you were not allowed to heal a person on the Sabbath day unless their life was at stake. But even if their life was at stake, if they were wounded, you could put a bandage on them, but you couldn't put ointment underneath the bandage. That would be breaking the law. You could only fix someone until the Sabbath day was over, then you could heal them. How many people healed in the first century? Jesus did. And so what he did was he made it very obvious. We find again and again, time and time again in the scriptures, that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day. We remember the story in Matthew 12 of a man who walked into the synagogue one day and he had a withered hand. It wasn't working right. And Jesus looked at the religious leaders who looked at him. They knew what he was going to do. And he knew what he was going to do. He saw the man, he said, "Come up here." The man came up. And he, right in front of everyone, said, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched out his hand, and Jesus healed it. And the religious leaders looked at him and said, "You're a sinner, Jesus. How dare you break God's command?" Yet in Jesus' mind, he was thinking, how dare you keep someone working on the Sabbath? This poor man, in every moment of his life, was working because he had a burden. Release him from the burden so he can enjoy rest for once. It was a different way of interpreting things. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says these words. I'll read it the way my interpretation. After they looked at Jesus, Jesus said, "Look, according to your own customs, according to your own traditions, if your sheep falls in a pit on the Sabbath day, you have allowed yourself to get that sheep out of the pit. You don't think it's allowable for me to help this man? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath day." Matthew also tells us that it was right after this miracle that the religious leaders plotted to kill Jesus. He was a sinner. Why? Because Jesus chose the law of God over the laws and customs of men. And God, he knew, Jesus knew, his Father did not take pleasure in his children obeying laws to keep them too busy to have a relationship with him. Jesus saw the laws as being good, of telling us what God wills, what God desires, and how we could walk in God's ways. Where the religious leaders sought obedience to the law, Jesus sought relationship with God through obedience to the law. Was Jesus softening the law of God? No. He was obeying the true law of God. Jesus made it clear that he was going to fulfill the law at its greatest extent. Listen to his words again, verse 17 and 18. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Whew. Jesus believed the law would be upheld throughout life and into the end. Not one jot or tittle is the translation sometimes we use. The jot is yod in Hebrew, which means it's the smallest of the consonants, kind of like a breath mark. It's a big backward apostrophe. That's a jot. A tittle is the decoration on a consonant, if you will, like a serif. We use like a capital A or a T and put a little foot on it. That's the tittle. That's the serif. Not one small consonant or little decorative mark of the law will pass away, Jesus said. Whew. Jesus was an observant Jew. One of my rabbi friends actually said, one of the problems we have with Jesus is that he's too strict for us. Wow. Listen to this. Because what I find troubling in this passage is what follows from what we just read. Listen what he says. Verse 20. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Oh no. Yikes. Who can be saved? I can tell you one thing, that if I could find salvation through obedience to the law, I still am way far behind what the Pharisees and the religious leaders, how they live their lives. If salvation could be found through the law, then I'm doomed. I'd probably imagine you are too. Because one thing I know from the Scriptures, that even Moses, the great lawgiver, was guilty of breaking the law. And if Moses can't make it, we can't either. Who can be righteous by the law? No one. And that's the point. It's by the righteousness of Jesus Christ that we stand. He who was an observant Jew obeyed the law to the jot and the tittle of it. And he who is true righteousness and the true law came to show us what God intended. And there upon the cross, as he offered the perfect sacrifice for the sins of the world, the lawbreakers, you and me, he said, "It is finished." And now God and humans are one. I've not come to abolish the law, Jesus said. I came to fulfill it. And by trusting in the work of Jesus' righteousness, we are made righteous. The righteousness of God cannot come through the law. True righteousness only comes from Jesus. It's about grace, not law. That's true righteousness. We've been forgiven by Jesus, and there's nothing we can do but to receive his righteousness by faith. Dwight Moody once explained how salvation comes to us by Christ's work, not ours. He wrote, the thief on the cross next to Jesus had nails through both of his hands so that he could not work. He had a nail through each foot so that he could not run errands for the Lord. He could not lift a hand or a foot toward his salvation, and yet Christ offered him the gift of God and he took it. Christ threw him a passport and he took him into paradise. Because Jesus fulfilled the law. And we'll never make it by the law. But we will make it by God's grace. And that grace, when it permeates our life and we live in that grace and we understand we have broken the law, but we receive the grace of God and we have things we don't deserve, we could never merit, we could never earn, then we begin to live the law. Because we don't believe in cheap grace, which is, God will forgive me. We say, no, we're transformed so we can live unto God. So we can live unto God. One of the greatest images of this, of the grace moment versus law, I think, is summarized in the famous book Victor Hugo's Les Mis. In that book, Victor Hugo points out the difference between law and grace. We find, for instance, a man named Jean Valjean. And you might remember him. It was during a very difficult time, and his heart was breaking for his sister and her children. So Jean Valjean went out and stole bread to feed them, and he was caught. He was put in prison 5 years. But those 5 years turned into 19 years until he was a miserable criminal, and he knew it. He just knew that he was rotten to his core. 19th year came and Jean Valjean was released from prison. And what he does is he goes to a bishop's house. And they're hungry and poor. The bishop invites him in and gives him a place to stay and feeds him a lavish dinner. And he's so hungry he eats it. But that night, Jean Valjean leaves the house and on his way steals all the silver, not all the silver, but a good portion of the silver and runs away. The next morning, the police bring Jean Valjean back to the bishop's home. They recognize the silver, and they bring it back to the priest. And as Jean Valjean is there, chains hanging upon him. I hope you can put yourself in that place too. Chains and burden. The police say, he's guilty. He said you gave him the silver. And the bishop says, I did. I gave him the silver. It's his. Jean Valjean, you were my guest. I'm angry at you because you forgot to take the candlesticks too. And he orders that the candlesticks be brought. They put in his bag. And as the police begin unchaining him, now they know that he's stolen this. They are confused and they walk away. There's Jean Valjean face to face with the bishop. And Jean Valjean says, why are you doing this? And here's the bishop, I quote, forget not, never forget that you have promised me to use this silver to become an honest man. Jean Valjean, my brother, you belong no longer to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I am buying for you. I withdraw it from dark thoughts and from the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. And in that moment of grace, Jean Valjean would go away. He'd struggle with it. You might remember in the story, he does some terrible things after that. Robs a little boy of his money. But as his life begins to be transformed by the grace he's received from the bishop, he then becomes a man of the law, and he redeems others as well. And that's what Jesus does for us. We are Jean Valjean. And Jesus says, you, my brother, my sister, never forget. You promised to use this grace to become an honest person. My brother, you no longer belong to evil, but to good. It's your soul that I'm buying for you. I withdraw it from the darkness, from the devil, from the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. That's grace. That's the fulfillment of the law. That's what Jesus does for us. We'll never make it by our merits. We'll never make it by the law. So Jesus teaches us what the law really means. God loves you. You can live a life worthy, a worthy life, only until you've been redeemed by God's grace. I want to end with the words of a man named A.B. Simpson, a preacher of long ago. He used to say that the gospel tells rebellious people that God is reconciled, that justice is satisfied, that sin has been atoned for, that the judgment of the guilty may be revoked, the condemnation of the sinner is canceled, the curse of the law blotted out, The gates of hell are closed. The portals of heaven open wide. The power of sin subdued. The guilty conscience healed. The broken heart comforted. The sorrow and misery of the fall undone. That's what Jesus has done. Jean Valjean, you are forgiven. Let's pray. Oh God, we know from the law we will never be righteous. The law is good, and it reminds us of your will, but it also tells us how far we fall short. Oh, we thank you for your grace. Jesus, we thank you that you are the fulfillment of the law, that by your mercy you have exchanged your righteousness for our righteousness, and that by faith, through grace, we might have that true righteousness to live our lives as noble and worthy people. Thank you, God. Amen.
We hope this service has been a blessing to you. We also invite you to join us to worship in person on Sunday mornings. We have services at 9:15 and 11:15. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.